So now that we've talked a little bit about why we animals need to eat, as well as the types of things we need to eat, we're going to start to look at digestion. So, how do we take those nutrients that are in our food and break them down into pieces that our body can actually use and can actually transport? So, of course, we need nutrients for lots of different things. I gave you some examples in lesson two, but I'm sure in lesson one you also found some more examples. The goal of the digestive system is to break the food into really small pieces, eventually so small that it's nutrients so that our body can actually absorb it. The circulatory system will then pick it up from our intestines and bring the nutrients all around our body to our cells. So today's lesson or this lesson here, we're going to be looking at how all the beginning parts work. So sort of from the mouth onwards to the stomach. Lesson four will deal a little bit more with the later parts, the small intestine and the large intestine. So you're going to find at the end of this lesson, there is a digestive system picture, and I would recommend sort of adding information to that picture. It's sort of like a study aid or a study tool. So just to kind of get us started, what happens in humans and other mammals is that we have a gastrointestinal tract. That's also known as the GI tract that runs from our mouth all the way to the end, which is the anus. And in typical adult humans, that GI tube is between 7 and 9 meters long. So, of course, depending on the body size, you may have a longer or shorter amount. That's why it's only an approximate one. So again, starting off our food's journey in the mouth, this is the location of ingestion, bringing the food in, as well as digestion. So we're going to talk about soon. Digestion can be mechanical or chemical. And something like the teeth, which we have different types of teeth, of course, are made of bones. Their job is to mechanically digest the food. So taking it and crushing it or grinding it into very small pieces. That is called mechanical digestion. So anything that uses like motion to actually make the pieces smaller. We need the teeth to do this in order to help us swallow our food, because if anyone has ever swallowed something that has been unchewed, for example, by accident, it's very, very painful, but can also cause blockages. And blockages in any of these systems are really not good. In the digestive system, because your throat is a shared passageway between both the esophagus and what ultimately is the trachea, you really don't want a blockage there that could cause you to choke and could cause blockage of your airway. So the teeth are really important in helping for that. In our mouth also, at the bottom, we have salivary glands, and their job is to make saliva. Saliva is not just water. You might notice that it's a bit thicker than water actually. It's composed actually of water as well as enzymes. And the water being in there actually helps reactions to happen, but it also helps us for the same reason to sort of lubricate our food and helps us to swallow it once we've started to chew it. And so the enzyme that's really important here, and I'm going to define enzymes in just a second for you, is called salivary amylase. And salivary amylase has the job of breaking starch into what's called maltose. So we talked about in lesson two, starch are these really big, long polysaccharides, complex carbohydrates. Maltose are this double rings. Okay, so they're a sugar with that are two rings stuck to each other. So that brings us to talk about what an enzyme is. I'm going to put that on hold for just a second. We talked a little bit about it in lesson two, which are there's sort of these machinery in the cells which are helping things to happen. So that's also the case here, which I'll just define in a few minutes. In our mouth, also important is the tongue, and the tongue is a muscle, of course. It helps to mix our chewed food with saliva. And what forms at this stage, after the tongue has mixed those together, you have a semi-solid. And that semi-solid of that partially digested material along with our saliva is called a bolus. The tongue also helps to push the bolus back towards the throat, which is also called the pharynx, helping us to swallow. So we're going to see that the partially digested material has different names throughout the process. Basically, once we put it in our mouth and start chewing it, we no longer call it food anymore. We now start to call it actually bolus once it's mixed with a bit of saliva. So that brings us to talk about enzymes. Enzymes, again, super important concept. You talk a lot more about them in grade 12. They are proteins which have a very specific job in our cell. So each enzyme has a very specific shape to fit some substrate, which I'm going to define in just a second. And its job is to carry out chemical reactions. In this case, in the case we're going to talk about now, digestion of our food. So without enzymes, many reactions would happen so slowly that it would not keep us alive. So enzymes will only work under very specific conditions such as temperature, pH, and so forth. Why I'm mentioning this is one of the problems with getting a fever, for example, is that your body temperature gets very high, and enzymes don't like to be removed from their ideal temperatures. So part of the problem of getting a fever, for example, is that these enzymes could actually start to become denatured. And when that happens, that essentially means that those enzymes are not useful anymore. It changes their shape. And in changing their shape, it also ends up changing their function. Okay. I mentioned here this can cause other illnesses and other symptoms as well. So definitely enzymes are really, really important. I'll give you one other example here before we go on. People who are lactose intolerant, their bodies do not make lactase, which is an enzyme responsible for breaking down lactose. And so what happens in people who are lactose intolerant is that the lactose makes it all the way into their intestines without being digested, and bacteria there start to break it down. And so the reason people feel really sick and bloated and have gas and so forth is because those bacteria are metabolizing the lactose for you. And so they're essentially creating lots of extra gas in the process, which doesn't make the person feel very good. So that's what I mean here by illness, right? It's if an enzyme is not functional or it's not there for whatever reason, it can cause lots and lots of problems. So I want to show a little bit how enzymes work, and this is showing what's called the lock and key model. We're going to see, I have shared a video as well with how enzymes work. Typically, it's not as rigid as this. We actually do see that some enzymes do change their shape slightly, but they will always have a very specific reactant or substrate that they work with. So in my diagram of like 1, 2, and 3 here, this makes it look like the enzyme is super rigid, but in reality, the enzyme does have moving parts as well, and it can move to actually help fit the appropriate substrate in. So this is still a very specific reaction. It's only one substrate that should bind into there, and that's called the active site. And essentially what I like to think of it is the site where the reaction actually takes place. So down at the bottom of the enzyme, there's no fitted spot for a substrate reactant to fit into. And so we are really concerned about the active site. The enzyme catalyzes or causes a reaction in step 2, which is then in number 3 going to actually break that substrate apart. Okay, and that releases then the products. The enzyme, which is really cool, this enzyme will continue to get reused by the cell. We call it a biological catalyst. And what that means is enzymes are always reusable. They actually, some of them work millions of times per second if you're looking at a really quick enzyme. So it's really important that, like I said, these do not become damaged and they can continue working on and on and on. In this particular unit, we're looking at enzymes that catalyze digestion. So we're looking at the breaking apart. But of course, there are many, many enzymes that are also putting something together. So their substrates would be 2 or 3 different things that they're binding together to make one whole product. We aren't going to talk about many of those this year, but in grade 12, like I was saying before, one of the jobs of enzymes, as an example, is to build DNA strands. So they're taking lots of parts and essentially making a big giant polymer of that. So another example, and the one that I was mentioning on the front page, is digestion of starch. So here I have my enzyme of amylase, and again, this is like salivary amylase. You can see a tiny water molecule over here. I mentioned that in the saliva, water is actually helping the reaction to happen rather. And what we see is this long polymer of starch is actually broken down into these two maltose units. Okay. Just to mention really briefly here, this is an example of what we call chemical digestion. We are actually we're actually breaking chemical bonds. So we are not just using force to break these open, we are actually using chemistry to break them open. Again, in terms of reactions for this, we can write chemical reactions. We just save that until grade 12 biology rather, where we will look at biochemistry. So we'll talk about all of the reactions that are involved with breaking things apart and putting things together and so on. In the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about swallowing. And swallowing is a reflex, which means it's involuntary and it's a reaction to a stimulus. So once the bolus reaches a certain point at the back of our throat, our body is going to continue with that process involuntarily and continue to allow us to swallow. So I've sort of divided it into 3 steps here. Like I said, we're calling it a bolus over here. We have the soft palate, which is essentially at the top, the roof of our mouth. And that's going to fold upwards to block the bolus from entering our nasal passage, so block it from going up into the nasal cavity. The tongue, as I mentioned before, is essentially pushing back. It's causing a bit of a seal to happen at the front of the mouth, and it's pushing the bolus towards the back. Meanwhile, in the throat, the larynx is actually pushing up on a structure called the glottis and the epiglottis. Those structures essentially aim to close off or seal off the trachea so that as we're actually swallowing the bolus, nothing goes into our airway. I mention right here, because we're always thinking about evolution and how are things advantageous, having a reflex like this, it's an adaptation which prevents food from entering our airway. So again, if food were able to enter there easily, that could cause lots of death, right? Because that's a blockage of the airway, which is super important. So this reflex, as I was saying, is actually an adaptation. It's advantageous to us to have this reflex. So moving on into the esophagus now. The esophagus is a muscular tube and it carries the bolus down to the stomach. Now I want to just reinforce, I've bolded a word here called peristalsis. Peristalsis are involuntary muscle contractions that essentially push things through the digestive tract. So any involuntary contractions that we have there, which the first one starts off in the esophagus, I cannot think about actually pushing that down. That happens involuntarily. Also happening in the stomach, also in the intestinal tract, in the small and large intestine. Those are all called peristalsis. Okay, it's involuntary contractions pushing things along. So then finally, after the esophagus, we make it to this J-shaped organ, which is known as the stomach. So I call it a J-shaped organ, and the reason it looks a J is just how it's drawn in this side. And what you'll see circled in the blue are what's called sphincters. So you see there is a sphincter at the top called the gastroesophageal, I call it the cardiac sphincter, and then at the bottom called the pyloric sphincter. And these are essentially muscles that seal off the top and bottom of the stomach. Now, I'm going to tell you about down below. When they relax, they will allow the partially digested material to move through them. But when they contract, they are really going to close off and really should seal off that stomach pretty well. So, looking at our first kind of structure as we enter, as I mentioned, we have the cardiac sphincter. And I put here example heartburn. So when that sphincter is not functioning as it should, and it's letting stomach contents actually go up into the esophagus, it can cause heartburn. So that kind of burning feeling that some people suffer from. And typically that's not a huge deal. However, some people have like repeated heartburn. They get it almost every day, or they get it really in serious ways. That's where it becomes problematic, because as acid and other contents start to move up into the esophagus, they actually can cause some tissue damage. And so what ends up happening is that the cells are trying to replicate really quickly to actually fix or replace those damaged cells. And in the meantime, that could actually cause things like cancers to happen. So it could be dangerous, but that's in like really, really serious kind of conditions. These muscle layers that I'm mentioning here, we're just going to see them on the diagram here. You can see on the very innermost surface, we call it mucosa. And mucosa is a very like bumpy surface. It has cells that make the gastric juices. So I'm going to talk about gastric juices in just a second, but these are the enzymes, the acid, all the things that goes into actually helping digest food in the stomach. Also super, super important, which we often don't think about, is these cells are helping to make mucus and hence the mucosa layer. The mucus is really important because as we're going to talk about, there is lots of acid being produced in the stomach, and that can cause damage to the stomach. So our bodies have evolved to have a way around that problem. Then we have the submucosa layer, which it's labeled on the diagram. It's difficult to see, but this essentially contains nerves and blood vessels. The purpose of the nerves being there is that it helps to control the muscles. It also gives us this feeling of fullness. So it's communication with our brain, telling our brain that we are full, or likewise telling our brain that we are hungry. So really important to have nerves there. The blood vessels, their whole job in being there and their whole purpose in being there is the stomach, just like the rest of our body, is made of cells. So we need to actually get some nutrients to those cells in order to keep them actually working properly. As we move into the muscularis layer, there's 3 layers of muscle and they're arranged sort of in different directions. So I've labeled those at the top here, which are labeled kind of in the black. We have longitudinal running one way, circular running around the stomach, oblique is running sort of diagonal in the stomach. So these layers of muscle, what their job is to do is to start actually churning that partially digested food. So this is a really good example of mechanical digestion because these layers will all move sort of in different directions. And what they are doing with this mechanical digestion is mixing that bolus with the stomach contents. And the stomach contents I'm talking about is actually the gastric juices. So once this step happens, we no longer call it a bolus anymore. We now call it chyme. And this is a very, very liquidy mixture. As I said, it contains that partially digested material still, as well as all these liquidy gastric juices. So that's what it's going to be called as it enters out or leaves the stomach rather and enters into the small intestine. The last one is the pyloric sphincter, and just like the cardiac sphincter, it essentially keeps the stomach contents, which at that point is the chyme, from moving into the small intestine until it's time to do so. So we're going to talk about under the gastric juices, there are some digestive things that have to happen first. In addition to, which we'll talk about in lesson 4, it's really important that food, partially digested chyme ahead of this, has had the chance to actually be absorbed. So it cannot just rush through the system, otherwise your body's not actually absorbing any of the nutrients. So the pyloric sphincter is helping to keep things in the stomach until it's ready to go to the next stage, and the next stage is actually ready for it to come. So looking at the gastric juices, we have mucus, as I mentioned. Its job is to protect that inner lining from damage, okay? I used an example of ulcers here. Ulcers are like little holes in the stomach lining and the mucosa layer, and they're extremely, extremely painful. They can be caused actually by things like stress, but they also can be caused by like a bacterial infection. And so those are really painful for people that experience them. But at that point, there has been sort of a break through the mucus, and so that is very problematic. We also have a strong acid, which is hydrochloric acid. Its job is to, number 1, kill microorganisms that we might have ingested, and number 2, it actually activates another enzyme, which is called pepsin. So HCl is not an enzyme. It doesn't have that action of like breaking things apart that we were talking about earlier. But what it does allow is to change the pH. So those of you who have taken chemistry, you know all about pH. In grade 10 science, we talk about it a little bit as well. Strong acid will make a low pH. And so what that does is actually activate an enzyme called pepsin. So pepsinogen is the inactive form of that enzyme. If you make it acidic, you lower the pH, you make that inactive enzyme into an active pepsin. And pepsin's job is to chemically digest protein. So it's basically taking the big, large proteins and breaking them into their small component parts, which are the amino acids. Now, I had mentioned before, these polymers, these proteins can be extremely large. They can be like thousands of amino acids in length. So most likely, pepsin is not digesting the whole protein, which is why we're going to talk about the small intestine has another enzyme, yet another enzyme just for that purpose. Now, what I'm mentioning here is that once pepsin has been mixed in with the bolus, which is now going to be called the chyme, we also need a way to deactivate it because pepsin's job is breaking down proteins. Well, it so turns out that our body, our organs, are made mostly of proteins. So if we just allow pepsin to be active all the time, we're going to cause some really serious damage to our tissues. So we're going to talk about in lesson 4 that the body has a way to actually help neutralize this acidic chyme. And in doing so, it also shuts down pepsin from working and stops that damage to our organs. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with in here is this little sheet, which is just a basic picture of the digestive system. What I would recommend that you do with this sheet and what I would use to help me study is I would, number one, label all the different parts. Obviously, today we've only talked about mouth, esophagus, and stomach. But what I'd add on to that is like what important steps are happening there. So in the mouth, for example, we have ingestion, and we also have the beginning of digestion. Within digestion, we have both mechanical, which was our teeth grinding things up and using force to break it open, as well as chemical, which is use of enzyme to break chemical bonds. So here we would have amylase starting to digest starch and making it into maltose. So my recommendation with this picture is you don't have to fill it all in right now, but start to actually put together almost as a study sheet, which is what happens in each of the places, not just what its name is, because that's very easy, but wanting to kind of have all in one place, almost a summary of what all happens through each of these processes. So in lesson 4, we will focus on the bottom half of the GI tract, which is the small and large intestine, as well as waste removal or egestion at the end of the process.